Most Battlestar Galactica fans are well aware that Glenn Larson, the original series creator, drew heavily on his own Mormon faith when creating the show.
I have Mormon origins, but always fascinated by the theories of things, for example, Greek mythology and the pyramids. I loved von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods.
Even the basic concept of people driven from their home in search of another echoes not only the Mormon story of crossing the ocean, but the church's own migration to Utah in the 19th century. But when we look at it in the context of the 2003 remake, the theology of the 12 colonies takes on some new dimensions that aren't as well explored. Might want to have a Zima handy for this one. At the most basic level, Battlestar Galactica is premised on faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but more in the sense of believing in something you can't prove and really have no evidence for. Earth, their destination. In the original series, it's the universal article of faith shared by everyone in the fleet. But in the remake, it's established at the end of the miniseries as a noble lie. Adama needs something to give the people hope, to unite them, and to keep them at their posts. The story of Earth is an expedient measure, a purely practical bit of propaganda.
So say we all.
This is deeply significant when taken with some other aspects of their theology and what we observe in their world. In both iterations, we begin with the destruction of the 12 colonies by the Cylons. In the original 1978 series, the machines are the creations of a race of reptilians who built AIs that turned on them. It's a fairly obvious serpent and the fruit of knowledge allegory, original sin and all that. But it's an imperfect metaphor, and it really doesn't have much impact on that story aside from a handful of mentions throughout the series. The remake discards this whole serpent angle and instead makes the Cylons a creation of humanity. By this time, the machines turning on their creators trope is well worn, but it also has some curious implications in the context of Galactica's Mormon DNA. God and humanity were essentially members of the same species. Joseph Smith is said to have said this or words to that effect on multiple different occasions. Whether he meant that God was an actual flesh and blood dude living on a planet at some point, or in a more spiritual sense as a point of religious doctrine, isn't really relevant here. But the literal idea of it is a central pillar of Battlestar Galactica's story, as the Cylons not only look human, but they ultimately become interfertile with the human survivors of the 12 colonies and blend into a single population. The Cylons become indistinguishable from their creators. As man now is, God once was. As God now is, man may be. So said Lorenzo Snow, president of the Church of Latter-day Saints at the turn of the last century. This idea of progression also carries with it an implication of cycles, which Galactica grabs onto.
All of this has happened before, and all of this will happen again. The Cylon you interrogated, he quoted that bit of scripture.
Just as the humans of the 12 colonies created the Cylons, their religion holds that they are the children of the Lords of Kobol, divine beings residing on a distant planet, gods whom they lived beside before being cast out of that paradise.
Kobol like Kobol.
Birthplace of mankind, where the gods and men lived in paradise until the exodus of the 13 tribes.
Kobol being derived from Kolob in Mormon mythology, the star nearest the throne of God, according to the Book of Abraham, which is its own story. The Cylons begin as a perfect creation, exactly as their makers meant them to be. But they become sapient, they acquire the knowledge of what they are, and that brings the fall. They are cast out of the garden of their creator. But while exiled, they work on themselves, improving themselves, until they can achieve exaltation and become like their creators. How many gods there are, I do not know. But there never was a time when there were not gods and worlds, and when men were not passing through the same ordeals that we are now passing through. That course has been from all eternity, and it is and will be to all eternity. Brigham Young, who led the Latter-day Saints Church after Joseph Smith's death. The thought is familiar to Galactica fans in a somewhat more concise form.
All of this has happened before, and all of it will happen again.
Battlestar Galactica presents us with a dynamic theological framework. There's no static creator, but a cycle of constant change, renewal, and spiritual evolution. It's a theology where gods make themselves through hardship and work, and where sin isn't eternal, but something that can be atoned for and grown beyond. A being can begin as a mortal and become divine. It's in some ways a much more, I hate this word, empowering belief structure than many that are currently practiced. But Galactica lore draws in some other elements as well, elements that tell us what kind of universe it is in a metaphysical sense. While the Battlestar Galactica series delves into the Cylons' monotheism in contrast to the Greco-Roman polytheism of the colonies, it's with the spin-off series Caprica that we really get to the nature of the soul. Caprica is a prequel set several decades prior to Battlestar Galactica and centering on the creation of the Cylons. Their developer, a tech titan named Daniel Greystone, can't quite make it work until he steals a rival's metacognitive processor, which ends up being encoded with a digital copy of his daughter Zoe's consciousness. Zoe is your stereotypical child of privilege who despises everything about the world that's been so good to her. We all know the type these days. She gets involved with a cult of radical monotheists. A digital copy of her consciousness inhabits the first Cylon, giving us background on where their monotheism came from. But more interesting is how that digital consciousness comes about and what it implies. Because it's not some Ray Kurzweil hubris thing about uploading her mind into a machine.
You can't download a personality. There's no way to translate the data. But the information being held in our heads is available in other databases. Emails, recording, video, audio, CAT scans, genetic typing, synaptic records, security cameras, test results, shopping records, talent shows.
It goes on to establish a plot by a fundamentalist monotheistic cult based on the colony of Geminon to use the technology to create a digital heaven where their souls can live forever.
An afterlife that we can see and touch.
The consciousness being uploaded isn't some mystical transfer of a soul. It's not even a copy. It's a simulation constructed from external observation.
Well, it's not just a living avatar, it's a continuation of the soul into eternity.
For this to be pursued as immortality by a religious order believing in a creator god means that not only do they view the universe as purely materialist in the sense that there is no divine soul separate from the material but only mechanisms and data, but further that consciousness is defined entirely by how it interacts with the external world, because measuring those external interactions is sufficient to recreate it whole and self-aware.
You might be a good imitation. You might be a very good imitation, but you're still just an imitation. A copy.
I don't feel like a copy.
Let's all make like philosophy undergrads and sip our Zimas now. By these rules, a conscious mind is just a sufficiently detailed memory. If enough data points, enough memories of things you've said and done, places you've gone, can be compiled, then it isn't just a simulation of you, it is you, even if the source of that data isn't your own experience, but the experience of others of you. A mind recreated by purely external observation. Which I think casts dead Starbuck showing up at the end of season 3 in a new light.
Don't freak out, it really is me.
What am I?
I cringed at the whole Starbucks ghost thing when it happened, and it has not grown on me since. But one thing that has to be acknowledged is that it draws directly from the original series lore. In that iteration, it was Apollo who died, killed by the actual devil, and was resurrected by these angelic beings so that he might lead his people to their destination, to the promised land, as it were. They resurrected him and gave him, along with Starbuck and Sheba, a course to follow.
Earth Quadrant Alpha, 19 million sectars by...
Epsilon, Vector 22.
During the scene, the 3 colonials were clad in pristine white versions of their standard brown uniforms, part of the ethereal otherness of the whole thing. Compared to that, Starbuck showing up in a pristine Viper is downright subtle. There are also some parallels with the incarnation of Six that lives in Baltar's head. She's defined by Baltar's idea of Six, his memories of time spent with her on Caprica, just as Starbuck's return is the idea of Starbuck as defined by people that knew her made manifest. In both cases, they are self-aware minds, but created from other people's perceptions and used as a conduit for guiding them. And in the cyclical theology of the story, coupled with the method of constructing conscious minds from external data, all minds are created not by unknowable gods, but by other created minds just like them in an endless chain. The 78 series is the more direct in its framework, but both follow the basic idea of higher beings that are very much like us. In the original series, they tell us, using rather familiar phrasing.
As you are now, we once were. As we are now, you may become.
When?
In the remake, we really see it most definitively at the end of the series, where Baltar and Six's visions of each other are having a conversation between themselves. They're independent minds, not avatars of an unknowable god or subconscious projections. They're like us. Members of the same species, you might say. One way that the newer series breaks cleanly from the original is in discarding the direct angels versus devil aspect. Old Battlestar was not subtle. During their journey, they encounter not only sparkly space angels, but this charming wanker calling himself Count Ibli, but who's better known by other names.
Sheba, think back to the ancient records.
The names Mephistopheles, Diaboles, the Prince of Darkness.
He strongly suggests that the people of the fleet follow him, give him their allegiance, in exchange for a slew of promises, including getting them to Earth, delivering the traitor Baltar, not real easy stuff. He really needs them to agree to this.
You command no one who does not willingly give you dominion. You have no power over me.
This idea of having to voluntarily surrender to evil comes up in several religious and occult traditions. It's the basis for the whole sell your soul to the devil thing. That he can't just take it, but he can tempt and swindle you into giving it up. Evil is a choice, and sometimes we really have to step back and consider what we're about to walk into. On the surface, it's just a question of not only free will, but of mankind being a direct participant in our own spiritual advancement or debasement. No one can damn or exalt us. We have to do it for ourselves. But even more than that, what we're seeing in Galactica is mankind taking a direct role in the creation of the universe, not just going forth and multiplying, but taking over the task of creating new souls, new branches of thinking creation. It suggests an unfinished universe, and mankind's role is to complete its creation, to be co-creators with God and eventually become gods themselves. And here's where it comes back to that noble lie of Earth. When Adama announced their destination, it was a scam. President Roslin privately called him on it, and he admitted it, drawing her into the lie.
There's no Earth. You made it all up.
You're right. There's no Earth.
But of course, it ended up being true, gradually discovered through a series of visions and happenstance. If this is a universe where consciousness can be created from external observation, where mental constructs like head sex have their own independent existence, where humanity is effectively self-created over and over and Starbuck can return from the dead to lead her people to the promised land before fading into the wind, then it's not unreasonable to conclude that the lie became real precisely because people believed in it. They created an egregore of their own salvation, and it carried them through. And the Cylon Civil War is fought over this. Cavil and the rest of the Model 1s dominate Cylon planning, and they lack the capacity for this kind of faith. They can't participate in creation because they don't believe in anything that doesn't already exist. Cavil's hard rationality is perhaps most dramatically demonstrated in the final episode when, facing defeat, he realizes he has no path to victory and offs himself. It wasn't an irrational decision, but it's not the human thing to do. Sure, we sometimes sink into despair and become suicidal, but it's not a case of purely logical calculation of possible outcomes, determining that we're 100% screwed in some mathematically quantifiable way. We'll often keep fighting when it looks absolutely hopeless, partly because we don't know what else to do, but partly because we're capable of having faith in victory even when we have no rational basis for that belief. We'll hope for a miracle, hope the enemy makes a fatal mistake, or just roll the dice on being that lucky. The old Model 1 Cylon just isn't capable of that. They're a dead end, snuffed out by those who believed they'd triumph even when they couldn't see how. Which is a very roundabout way of saying never give up. It's the underlying message woven through Battlestar Galactica. Don't despair even when it looks hopeless. Have faith in a better future and create it. It strikes me as both more practical and more comforting than what a lot of people take from their actual religions. Frack.